The news of an international arrest warrant being issued against Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, immediately ignited a global storm of reactions. The move, pushed through channels of INTERPOL, was intended to delegitimize his leadership, restrict his movements, and place immense diplomatic and political pressure on his government. Yet, instead of crippling him or isolating Burkina Faso, the warrant backfired in spectacular fashion, fueling waves of solidarity across Africa, raising serious questions about the legitimacy of global institutions and revealing the deep fracture between African aspirations for sovereignty and the entrenched influence of Western powers. To understand why this unprecedented moment shook the world, one must first examine the political context surrounding Traoré, the role of international policing bodies, and the growing tide of Pan-African unity that has made such strategies ineffective, even counterproductive. Ibrahim Traoré rose to power not as a career politician, but as a military officer whose defiance of the status quo resonated with a people weary of exploitation, terrorism, and dependency on foreign powers. His rise signaled the emergence of a new type of African leadership, bold, unapologetic, and fiercely protective of national sovereignty. Unlike traditional leaders who often balanced their rhetoric of independence with dependency on Western aid and approval, Traoré carved out a different path. He prioritized regional alliances, emphasized the rejection of neocolonial control, and openly challenged institutions that for decades operated as enforcers of Western dominance. For supporters, this made him a symbol of hope. For his adversaries, it made him a threat that needed to be neutralized. The issuance of an arrest warrant by Interpol against a sitting African head of state is not only extraordinary, but also controversial. Interpol, originally designed to assist international police cooperation in cases of organized crime, terrorism, and transnational criminal networks, is often accused of being misused for political purposes. Governments with greater influence sometimes attempt to use its mechanisms to silence dissidents, exiles, and political opponents under the guise of law enforcement. The targeting of Traoré fit this pattern, raising questions over whether the global policing organization was acting as an impartial institution or as a tool for maintaining geopolitical order favorable to Western powers. Almost immediately after the announcement, African voices across the continent erupted in outrage. Political leaders, intellectuals, activists, and ordinary citizens condemned the warrant, framing it as another attempt to undermine African sovereignty. Demonstrations were held not only in Ouagadougou, but also in cities across West Africa, where Traoré's leadership had already inspired solidarity movements. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, where juntas and reformist governments are steering their nations away from Western influence, the warrant was treated as an attack not just on Traoré, but on the broader Pan-African struggle. Crowds gathered chanting that Africa would no longer bow to Western dictates, and social media campaigns went viral, portraying Traoré as a victim of unjust persecution rather than a criminal. The reaction was so swift and widespread that the very goal of the warrant collapsed. Instead of painting Traoré as illegitimate, it painted Interpol as compromised. Instead of isolating Burkina Faso, it brought the country closer to its African neighbors who shared the same frustrations. The backfiring was evident in the diplomatic arena as well. Several African governments, though not always aligned with Traoré politically, expressed their discomfort with a precedent being set. The African Union, which has often faced criticism for inaction, found itself under pressure to respond to what was perceived as an affront to African sovereignty. Discussions emerged about whether Africa needed its own continental policing system, independent of Western-dominated institutions, to prevent such interference. The symbolism of the moment cannot be overstated. For decades, African leaders who stepped out of line often found themselves targeted by sanctions, warrants, and even coups backed by foreign powers. Many crumbled under the pressure, either deposed or forced into exile. Traoré, however, became stronger because, unlike in the past, the African people themselves are more aware, more connected, and more willing to resist external manipulation. The digital age has given rise to an informed youth who quickly interpret actions like these as attacks on African dignity, and they mobilize their voices online to counter global narratives. Hashtags calling for African sovereignty trended across platforms, amplifying Traoré's stance and diminishing the credibility of the warrant itself. Moreover, the warrant inadvertently gave Traoré global visibility. Leaders who may not have followed his policies closely now found themselves compelled to read about him, to analyze why such a measure was taken, and to engage in conversations about African sovereignty. International media, while often framing events from a Western perspective, could not ignore the backlash, and in attempting to cover the outrage, they further elevated Traoré's image as a leader who dared to resist. What was intended as an act of criminalization became an act of recognition, turning Traoré into a household name far beyond Africa. This outcome highlights the limitations of institutions like INTERPOL when applied to political struggles rather than genuine criminal justice. For many Africans, the warrant confirmed long-held suspicions that these institutions are not neutral, but are instruments of power designed to maintain global hierarchies. Just as the International Criminal Court has been accused of disproportionately targeting African leaders while ignoring crimes committed by Western states, Interpol now faces a similar crisis of legitimacy. If it cannot act impartially, its credibility erodes, and in this case, it has done exactly that. Inside Burkina Faso, the warrant only deepened the resolve of the people. Instead of panicking or questioning their leader, citizens rallied in defense of him. State media amplified the narrative of resilience, portraying Traoré as a modern-day revolutionary facing the full weight of imperial pressure. His speeches during this period echoed themes of justice, independence, and self-determination, drawing not only from Burkina Faso's own history of resistance under Thomas Sankara, but also from the broader legacy of African anti-colonial struggles. By rejecting fear and doubling down on sovereignty, Traoré turned the warrant into a badge of honor rather than a burden. For his critics, the move was equally problematic. Those who hoped to see him weakened were forced to contend with the reality that their efforts had strengthened him instead. Western governments, often cautious in acknowledging their involvement in such affairs, now faced accusations of interference. Their silence or denial did little to quell suspicions, and in the eyes of many Africans, the warrant itself became evidence of their hidden hand. Thus, rather than eroding Traoré's legitimacy, it eroded theirs, making it harder for them to present themselves as partners in Africa's development. The broader implication of this incident lies in its demonstration of Africa's shifting dynamics. The continent is no longer as pliable as it once was. Attempts to impose narratives or exert pressure through international bodies are met with skepticism and resistance. Leaders like Traoré, who embody a spirit of defiance, find themselves celebrated rather than condemned when targeted. The warrant has, in essence, highlighted that the balance of power is changing and that Africa is increasingly capable of asserting its own voice. In practical terms, the backfiring of the arrest warrant may accelerate efforts to build alternative systems. Already, discussions around African monetary independence, military alliances, and trade blocs are gaining momentum. The idea of creating African-centered institutions, whether for justice, economics, or security, is no longer theoretical. The warrant serves as proof of the need for such independence, as Africans can no longer trust that global institutions will treat them fairly. This could mark the beginning of a long process of decoupling from external dominance. At a human level, Traoré's resilience in the face of such international pressure inspires millions. It reassures Africans that their continent can produce leaders who will not bow, who will not trade dignity for convenience, and who will stand firm even under immense scrutiny. This psychological effect may be the most important consequence of all. For too long, Africans have been told that they must conform to global structures or risk chaos. Traoré's example proves that defiance does not lead to collapse, but can instead create strength, unity, and pride. As the dust settles, it is clear that Interpol's warrant against Ibrahim Traoré did not achieve its intended outcome. It did not weaken him, did not isolate Burkina Faso, and did not dissuade Africans from supporting his vision. Instead, it achieved the opposite. It emboldened his supporters, exposed the bias of international institutions, and amplified his global stature. What was meant as a weapon became a gift, a reminder that Africa is entering a new era where attempts to control it through intimidation no longer succeed as they once did. In the end, the warrant will likely be remembered not as a legal instrument, but as a political blunder. It will be studied as a case of overreach, a moment when the forces of global control underestimated the resilience of African consciousness. Traoré emerges not as a fugitive, but as a symbol of defiance, and Interpol, instead of demonstrating authority, reveals its vulnerability. The backfire is complete, and with it comes a new lesson for the world. Africa is no longer a continent to be managed, but a continent ready to lead.